You may be seated. Between this week and next week, we're going to be talking about sacred space. Sacred space in two movements. The first movement, I would like us to consider how we are sacred space, each one of us. And next week, how we are sacred space together. When I first started researching sacred space, I thought of the 15 spiritual direction books I have sitting on my shelf that talk about creating an environment where a client is comfortable, where you have the ideal 18 inches between your knees, and you have candles and chimey things and soft music in the background. But typically, none of us actually encounter an ideal setup to having sacred space. So then, of course, I took a moment and I searched on the internet to see what would pop up. And everything that came up seemed to be about how do you create this environment, right? There were 6 ways to create sacred space in your home and at work. Creating the perfect altar. 8 tips to create a sacred space that will replenish your spirit. Now, don't get me wrong. I think a soothing home and work environment is important. But it seems to be missing the most essential ingredients. My search for that perfect definition of sacred space continued. Then I found Allie Irwin. She's a massage therapist, and this is her definition of sacred space. It is the physical and energetic meeting place where the mind, body, and spirit come together to realize personal and divine grace. That's pretty awesome. And that's from a layperson. I don't need those books and theology, right? So that is what I call a juicy definition, right? Something you can sink your teeth into, and it kind of drips all over you because it's so full of meaning. So then we have just this idea of sacred. Sacred comes from the ancient word sacra, which means holy. And if you take the word holy back through time, it comes from the ancient Greek word hagia, which was in a Greek font at one point. It was sacred, healing, wholeness, health, and happiness. It is a space that is pure, holy, and safe, where everyone is protected. And that comes to us from shamans. So before we get any further in this discussion of how we are sacred space, I'm going to declare this space sacred. Holy ground, sacred and safe, pure and holy. So I'd like to do a little ritual together. It's going to get you out of your comfort zone, and it's going to help us ground ourselves just a little bit. So a little bit of the backstory is I spent some time with a Jewish rabbi, and we were talking about God's name in the Old Testament. And it is spelled YWHW or YVHV, right? So there's no vowels in this. We've added vowels into it to come up with some ways to be able to actually say the name. But his understanding is there are no vowels. That as you say it, you leave the vowels out, and it sounds like the breath of God. You say, Yahweh. We say Yahweh, that puts the vowels in. But without the vowels, it's Yahweh, right? It has this kind of breath and spirit to it. So I want you to hold on to that, and we'll come back to that, okay? So follow me. We're going to put our hands on our hearts. And we're going to say to God, your pattern is perfection. And then we're going to lift our hands to God. All right? Your pattern is perfection. And then back. It quiets the soul. It quiets the soul. And your hands go down. And it's eloquent expression. Makes everything clear. So that even the simple are wise. and just a heartbeat. Okay, one more time, all together. Your pattern is perfection. It quiets the soul, and its eloquent expression makes everything clear, so that even the simple are wise. And may the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Yahweh, my breath and my release. All right? May the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Yahweh, my breath and my release. All right, my release. There we go. So this is sacred space. We are sacred space. God has created in us sacred space. If we have the eyes to see and the ears to hear. And as that shaman said, it is sacred space that is pure and holy and safe. And that is sometimes really hard to hold on to. Our scripture story helps us to see both ends of this circle. Right? Both ends of the circle is right the same, isn't it? Yeah. Someone who knows they have sacred space, Jesus, and someone who maybe is not so sure that they hold sacred space. So this is how the scripture story goes. Jesus was really tired, right? He's traveling around with the disciples, and he's been up speaking with Nicodemus all night, and it is a hot day. He's tired, thirsty, and hungry. We've all been there, right? He takes a seat by the ancient well dug by Jacob, the son of Isaac, the grandson of Abraham, in Samaria, right? Or in the Samaritans. The ancestor of the Israelites and the Samaritans. Jacob's well is in the town of Suhar, right? In Samaria. Jesus sends the disciples off to go get some food, and he is sitting there about midday. Again, he's thirsty, but he forgot his cup. Just saying. And so he has to wait for somebody to come along who has a cup, because you can pull the water out of the well, but he has nothing to drink it out of, right? So he's sitting there waiting, and a woman approaches. Now, here's an aside. The Samaritan and the Jews did not get along very well. They were essentially parted by what we would call today worship wars. Yeah? Wait, I heard somebody. Who knows what worship wars are, right? The Jews declared that Jerusalem is the only place and the only way to worship. And the Samaritans declared that Mount Gerizim is the only place and the only way to worship. So they were so divided that they warred against each other, and they stayed separated for centuries. This argument became so intense that they became ancient enemies. So here at this well of the ancestors of Jacob, Jesus reaches out to his ancient enemy, the Samaritan woman, and he asks her for water. This is shocking, right? For two reasons. They're ancient enemies, and she's a woman outside talking to a man. This is not acceptable behavior during this time, right? But she's a lone woman coming to the well in the middle of the day. So scholars tell us that the reason she would be there alone during that time is because she was avoiding the rest of her community. She is a woman coming to the well who has a wounded heart. Jesus asks her for water. She responds in shock, saying, "I can't believe that you, a Jew, would ask me, a Samaritan, for water." See? She's shocked, right? Jesus replies by telling her about a God that offers living water. Now, I don't want to get too far in the story because we're going to revisit it next week. But this is what I want to focus on right here. What did Jesus bring to the well in himself that day? And what did the Samaritan woman bring to the well in herself that day? So Jesus, we know, brings himself and the opportunity for living water. And on this day, he may have been thirsty and hungry, but here's what we know about Jesus. He practices good self-care, right? So when he's hungry and thirsty, he asks for food and he asks for water. He sends for food when he needs it. And before he even gets to Suhar, we know that he is a man who retreats into the wilderness and who prays, who studies Scripture, and practices good spiritual practices or spiritual disciplines, right? He's a man who laughs, who loves, and he cries. He's a man who practices what he preaches. And then what about the Samaritan woman? What does she bring? She brings a wounded heart, like so many of us have. But she also clearly knows whose she is. She is a descendant of Jacob, who is descended of Abraham, who is descended and sent on a mission of the one God to have a covenant for the world, right? And then what about this well that has shown up here? It is symbolic of two things. It is the well of the ancestors, going back to Abraham. And then what do we know about God and Abraham? That his descendants would be more numerous than the stars in the sky. And she's a descendant. And she claims that. And she knows it. So we see that Jesus brings a lifetime of spiritual and mature spiritual practices to support him in this endeavor. And that the Samaritan woman also brings herself as supported by the disciplines that she was able to participate in during that day. So this foundation of spiritual practices that they both have allows them to be present to one another, even though they are ancient enemies. I think that's pretty amazing. Showing up to your enemy is kind of amazing, right? There's a lifetime of practices that will support you in awkward situations, because I have to imagine that she felt, at least, that this was an awkward situation, because it creates inside of you sacred space, a place of wholeness and healing and safety. You cannot be threatened by your enemy when your internal foundation is sacred and safe, holy and pure. There's a book called The Spiritual Disciplines Handbook, and it has 52 different spiritual practices for people to try out. And I would guess that there's even more than 52. We are only limited in spiritual practices by our imagination. So a spiritual practice or discipline is that which opens up this sacred space within each of us. It's that physical and energetic meeting place where the mind, body, and spirit come together to realize personal grace and divine grace. Spiritual practices are a means of grace, as Wesley would say. So there's different kinds of spiritual practices, and we can categorize them three ways. There's internal practices. Who can think of what we would describe an internal practice? Prayer. There's external practices, so things we do outside of ourselves. I'm sorry. Walk the labyrinth, right? And corporate, which is, things we do as a body. Yeah. I was afraid that was going to be not gotten. So there are these different kinds of spiritual disciplines that fit into these kind of categories, and we can all participate in them. So I have a question. Now I'll give you 2 sentences to think of an answer. What is your favorite spiritual practice? So what is that brings you closest to that which is safe and sacred and pure and holy right here? Or maybe another way of saying, what fills your cup when you are hot and thirsty? I'm sorry? Singing, and especially singing your favorite hymns. Yeah? Well, somebody said prayer as one of these kind of practices earlier. Somebody have prayer as a favorite practice? Meditation. Morning prayer. Mm-hmm. Yes. So we're just rocking and being held by a prayer shawl. I saw a hand over here. Up over here. An insightful sermon. I'll get back to you on that. Over here. Volunteering. Service to others. And it's even bigger than that. There's walking. What if you walk and you notice everything around you? Or if you walk with a notice of what is sacred, in and out. One of my favorites is photography as a sacred spiritual practice. Seeing the world as God sees it. There's all kinds of things. What do you just love to do? There's spiritual practices. What do you just love to do? Music maybe over here in the... Do you think music could be a spiritual practice? Do you feel close to God? Does it create that which is sacred and pure? Sometimes. Although I do get to listen to some of the junior high detention kids' music, and that sacred and pure part, I'm not sure. So in the work that I do with incarcerated youth that I engage in, I could not enter the room without a firm foundation, built by Christ, and by practicing the spiritual disciplines that appear in my online community, beginagain.com. So this is one of my recent nights in detention, and it was the first night that I was training my new interns. Say yay for interns. So this was her night to do the shadowing. And so in shadowing, you actually go together and you do a one-on-one visit with a youth, but there's 3 of you because I need to be a witness to the work that she's going to do before she gets my stamp of approval. Right? So we go, and the first youth that wants to meet with us had gotten in trouble that day. So what does that mean? He can't come out of his room. So we go to his room and say, you can't come out of your room. We can talk at the door. The 4-inch metal door, right, with the little tiny window that's like this. And to talk through it, you kind of have to talk a little loud. I'm good at loud, though, I'm just saying. So we're at the door, we're talking, and I explain, this is my intern, blah, blah. And he's like, yes, I want to talk still. And I'm like, well, that was a surprise, because usually kids don't want to talk at the door. If they do anything at the door, they just want you to pray for them and for you to be on your way. So his first question, this is my intern's first question ever in detention. How do you know that God has forgiven you? Easy peasy. I said, Trina will be happy to answer that question. Right? So I did. I stepped away from the door and I let Trina handle it, and she did a wonderful job. But that is because she has a sure foundation built by practicing spiritual practices and disciplines over and over, so that she has a well of spirituality and love, sacred space, holy and pure, that just pours out of her onto the youth that are so troubled and in such dire straits that these are the questions that they're asking. And we can all be that person. We are created in the image of God. We are sacred space. We have that well within us. And if we work out properly, doing our prayer push-ups, was actually a thing I make the youth in detention do, or we lift our meditation weights, right? Or if we do an allegro dance with the divine, we are all working out our sacred space muscles, shoring up that space so that we will indeed be sacred and safe, pure and holy. And when we are that person who carries sacred space with these flexed muscles to support it, we are then prepared to go out into the world and to be sacred space in dialogue with the world. But that's for next week. So I have an assignment for all of you. And I know Lynn will do this. Right? Take a moment every day And do the spiritual practice that makes you aware of the sacred space where your body, mind, and spirit come together with the divine. Flex your spiritual discipline muscles. Then carry that personal and holy space into the world with you. When you're filled with that sense of sacred space, you will see that we are all sacred space. May the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Yahweh, my breath and my release. Shalom and amen.